Hello, Shishu.
Yeah. Yes, Dr.
Hang
Bala.
on.
Good evening. Good evening,
Good
everybody.
evening. Let me
Hi,
just
Shruti.
remove the.
Hi, hello everyone.
Hi, good evening. Good evening.
Hi.
Shishu, can I make you the co-host? I'm not able
Sure.
to because your email was not being accepted. But let me make you the 1 second. Okay.
Hi, Gayathri.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Wait, I have to.
Hi, Gayathri.
Oh, hi. Hi.
Hi.
I can't see everyone's faces on this, but it's yeah, nice.
Go
Guys,
to
how do I
gallery.
disable the waiting room?
Um,
I
just
have to go
accept people
to.
as and when they keep coming. It'll just pop up.
Yeah, I know it's a pain.
I
Hang on.
know. I don't know on Zoom how
No,
to
no,
disable the
there's a
waiting
way to
room.
do this. I'm just figuring it out. 1 sec.
I think anybody else can just admit them. So rather than wait till we figure it out. So I think we should start because unusually so many people have logged in at exactly 4. And let's respect
Yeah.
all of those who have done it. And so lovely to see you, Shruti and Gayathri. Maybe Shishu, you did all the groundwork. Maybe you could start the proceedings and then Bala could take up.
Shishu, I'm just making you the host in case I have to leave in between. So change
Sure.
host. Okay, you're now the host. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's nice to see you all. We have how many people? We have about 14 people, including the 2 speakers. Go ahead,
Okay.
Shishu.
Yeah. I'm just getting it there. 1 minute. Um, I'm just pulling out the paper and the.
No, you start talking and introducing and saying hello. Then you can pull out the paper later.
Okay. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this session organized by IAP Tamil Nadu, IAP Intensive Care Chapter, Tamil Nadu and Puducherry. So this is a state branch of the main IAP Intensive Care Chapter for Shruti and Gayathri, though Gayathri would be knowing about it. This is basically this session was mostly done because both Gayathri and Shruti and Gayathri are involved in this major multicentric trial called STARSHIP, which is the status of cerebrovascular autoregulation relates to outcome in the severe pediatric head injury, which is a multicentric prospective trial on the PRX. Shruti has been the chief investigator and Gayatri has been the principal investigator at her site. So this session will be more for insight into how a multicentric trial has been done and how they have, what all difficulties they faced, how was it, how did they progress, and what actually were the outcomes of this study. So this was spearheaded by Shruti. Shruti is one of the first IAP fellows from India. She's one of the first batches of the IAP fellows, and then she moved on to UK. I had a pleasure of working with Shruti in Great Ormond Street, where we worked together for nearly, I think, 6 months. And then I have to comment here that Shruti has been quite helpful during that period. And it's after so many years I get to see her back here in this session. Shruti, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Shrishu. And it's just absolutely overwhelming to see everybody here. Some of who have been my teachers and examiners, exactly as you mentioned for the IAP fellowship, Suchitra and Bala, I can see here. So thank you for this invitation. And it's a huge honor to be talking about our study on this. Shrishu, I know from, gosh, it kind of reveals our ages, more than 15 years back when we worked together at Great Ormond Street. I'm currently based in Cambridge. My primary role is clinical, so I'm a pediatric intensivist. And on top of that, I do I'm the pediatric trauma lead for the trust, and I do some research on the side. So that's me in a nutshell. And over back to you, Shrishu.
That was quite crisp and small. The second person here is Gayathri. Gayathri is again one of our fellows from Chennai. She did her medicals at Varda, if I'm not mistaken, Gayathri. Yeah. And subsequently was assistant professor at Ramachandra and then started her fellowship in Apollo. And currently, Gayatri is at Manchester. Over to you, Gayatri. Can you also introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thanks, Rishu. Thanks, everyone, for joining. So I'm a pediatric intensivist. I work at Royal Manchester Children's Hospital. I have a special interest in palliative care in children. And I'm also the organ donation lead for my trust for children. My involvement in this study is extremely peripheral, but the study is very close to my heart because this was the first study that I was a PI for, and I learned quite a bit from the study. So hoping that we can use this time now to share what we learned. Thank you.
Thanks, Gayatri. Without wasting much of time, I would pass on the baton to Shruti. And Shruti, you can go ahead and tell us all about her studies.
Thank you, Shrishu. I'd start sharing. Let me see if I can.
So I just add that real congratulations from the bottom of our hearts from all of us. It's so wonderful to see this multi-center study spearheaded by Shruti and with our own Gayathri in the mix. So wonderful, and we look forward to a time of great learning. And yeah, that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Chitra. You've been an inspiration. And I think I must start by saying that I have learned so much and I've felt so motivated from my early days in intensive care in India, starting at Gangaram Hospital. My teachers at that time, Dr. Sachdev and Dr. Chuk, have had a huge influence in how I practice. And then, of course, all of you as the faculty during that time for the exam, as well as when we used to come and listen to you in the conferences, there's always that aura of how we can try and improve the field of intensive care and improve the evidence base. So starting from that, this is what Shrishu asked me to talk about, is to how we conduct a prospective multicenter research. And I thought the title would be quite fitting if we say that we take a ride on for that through STARSHIP. Try and do a little bit of a joint act between Gayathri and me. And as Shrishu already highlighted, the STARSHIP actually is an acronym for Studying Trends of Autoregulation and Severe Head Injury in Pediatrics. Oops. So I'm just trying to find the, yeah, that's better. Okay, so this is the publication part of the press. It actually went online only last month and went into one of the Lancet Group journals. It's eClinical Medicine. We initially submitted it to Lancet Neurology, which reviewed it and then passed it over to eClinical Medicine. So through this talk, I'd hope to try and highlight what exactly is research design and preparation, how do we select and launch the study sites, followed by recruitment of participants in an informed consent process. How do we then collect and manage the data and make sure that we are keeping quality assurance and monitoring the data collection, followed by analysis and reporting of data. And I guess the key, even before we start thinking about the design element, is to think about what question we are trying to ask and how we then design our research around that. So in a PICO format, for us, the primary question here is the population that we're trying to study, which is traumatic brain injury in pediatrics. I must confess, I've always had a neurology, neurocritical care interest from early part of my training. And for me, it was always quite astounding to see that despite a hugely disabling disease, we still have very limited evidence base in how we manage these children on pediatric intensive care. Nearly 50% of those who survive would have poor neurological outcome at 6 months. And majority of the treatments that we use on ICU are based upon the adult evidence with very limited structure from pediatric evidence. And this is the population we are dealing with. And this figure I find extremely telling, because if we look at it right from an infant whose head is nearly 1/4 of their body size all the way to the adult, this is our patient population. We also know that at this peak time, there is a huge developmental changes occurring physiologically, anatomically, as well as functionally in the brain, all the way from birth to acquiring adult level functioning. So it just feels wrong that when we are managing our patients, this is the last guidance from the Brain Trauma Foundation, which is the international guidelines for managing pediatric TBI. This is how we still manage our children. We have limited to no evidence in any of these guidelines. They're based on level 3 at the best. 2 guidelines are based on level 2. The ICP monitoring is suggested. And when it comes to the thresholds as to how I manage my patient bedside, the threshold for intracranial pressure is less than 20, which we know is an adult number. As well as for CPP, the values have been suggested between 40 to 50, perhaps 40 if we consider as the lower limit below which we should never go. But then the guideline acknowledges that there is no evidence base, and perhaps we can try and make it age appropriate depending on what the patient we have. So lots of uncertainty, very limited evidence as to what should be the right threshold. Again, going back into physiology, we do know that the cerebrovascular dynamics in pediatrics is very different. There are age and gender-related differences in intracranial pressure, cerebral blood flow, and cerebral auto-regulation. We do know that the lower limit of auto-regulation may not be lower in the lower age groups. And there is significant evidence to suggest that the autoregulatory mechanisms have an association with the outcome, to the extent that in pediatric traumatic brain injury, nearly 1/3 to 2/3 of the patients affected, especially our population, when we're talking about intensive care, have impaired cerebral auto-regulation. So it just feels wrong that we're still managing patients based upon some adult numbers, and specifically when it comes to CPP targets, anything between 40 to 50 may or may not be adequate for our patients. So just going into very, very briefly into cerebral auto-regulation, it's an important concept. It is what keeps our cerebral blood flow relatively constant, irrespective of the changes in our systemic blood pressure. And we do know now that with an injured brain, these autoregulatory mechanisms move up and down, and we don't know exactly which direction it has gone, as well as it's a dynamic process, so it's not static. Earlier, we used to feel that perhaps the cerebral autoregulation is completely lost. Now we know that it is not lost, and maybe the so-called cerebral autoregulation plateau, in which the blood flow remains relatively constant, shifts, whether it shifts leftwards, rightwards, up and down, or the actual plateau becomes narrower, depends upon the stage in the patient's disease process, and it's an evolving disease process. I guess it's important to highlight that now we're living in the big data age, and specifically within intensive care population, there's a lot of interest into how we could use the normally physiologically collected data that we use during monitoring our patients, how we could use that data to understand the disease pathology better, and how we could use it to make the management better. So this is one such tool which was developed here in Cambridge, where you can actually collect everything that is being monitored for the patient on ICU into a software. And the beauty is that you can then use that data, you can look at it over 5 seconds, you can make it very granular, as well as getting the overview of what the patient's physiology is doing over 10 minutes, 1 hour, all the way to 1 day. And what it does also is that it's not just, we all know that physiological processes they're not working in isolation. So we can then start linking the differences in different physiological patterns over a period of time and try and link it up and see whether we can predict or perhaps use that information to improve the patient level targets. And the good thing about this is because we can use this data in real time, we could perhaps make real-time judgment depending upon the disease stage and use that to manage the patient. So very briefly, talking about how it through a patient, and actually this is one of the patients recruited to our study, and we are extremely grateful to the family for allowing us to use her picture and her story. So this little girl is now 18. She was 12 years old when she presented with traumatic brain injury. She was on a quad bike, lost her focus just for a second, and then went into a tree. So her GCS at the scene was 5. She was intubated by the pre-hospital crew at the scene. She had one dilated pupil, required some osmolar therapy before she presented to us in Cambridge. And long and short, she spent 3 weeks on intensive care with us. She ended up having the full spectrum of neurocritical care, as we could imagine, all the way from neuroprotection, third phantom coma, EVD, decompressive craniectomy. This is her when she left the hospital after 3 months. So you can see she's got a helmet because she's still got decompression. And this is her a year later when she came back to say thank you to the pre-hospital crew who had initially resuscitated her. So this is just to highlight the typical trauma pathway across UK in a network structured fashion. And this is her monitoring from the period she spent in intensive care. And as you can see, we've just highlighted the arterial blood pressure, cerebral perfusion pressure, which are color-coded along with intracranial pressure, and how the software then can decipher the transmission of the arterial pressure changes into the intracranial compartment and give us an index, which is the pressure reactivity index. And this is what has been studied quite extensively, specifically in the adult population, and has shown outcome association in terms of the impairment of cerebral upregulation. Perhaps we'll not go into further details, but this is just to highlight how this could give us a full spectrum of what is happening with the patient. We can also then try and expand and go granular and try and understand how different interventions have impacted the patient's physiology over a period of time. So this is what PRX does. It takes the input signals, which is intracranial pressure and arterial pressure, and then the software very cleverly does Fourier transformation of these waveforms and gives us the output trend of the, which gives us an idea about how the cerebral upregulation is in the brain. Now it's important again to highlight, as I said, the outcome of our study is great, but it is extremely important to know that this work has been going on for more than 30 years, and we do need to have some proof of concept of whatever we are studying. And this was the first paper that came out from Cambridge using this monitoring method to suggest that how it is correlated with the outcome in good autoregulation and impaired autoregulation. And the evidence base in the adults has been building up since then. This was then validated in a PET study to suggest that the autoregulatory measures that we are studying clinically do correlate. And then it has been also studied in an experimental model to suggest that we're definitely looking at the right numbers and not just a concept that somebody has thought about. And over the last 3 decades, there have been multiple studies, multiple evidence to support the use of PRX in the adult TBI population. Now coming to our population, we're talking about children, of course, and how does the evidence sit within pediatrics? So this was the first study in 2009 where PRX was used in pediatric TBI population, showed similar outcome association as the adult data. And some other single center retrospective studies, and finally the PRX has been incorporated in some capacity within the last iteration of the TBI management guidelines, because there is an acknowledgement that the current targets that we're using may not be appropriate for the patients. So how did we start building up? So this is kind of the patient population. We've identified that we are looking at the pediatric traumatic brain injury population, patients who are admitted in intensive care, who require intracranial pressure monitoring and arterial pressure monitoring as a part of their management. We've understood that there is some proof of the PRX working in adult population, as well as some in pediatric populations. And this is some work which we did as a proof of concept within our own center, which we published in 2016. And as you can see, possibly only 12 patients, we could still show the outcome association as has been studied. But given the fact that all these studies are single center, more or less retrospective, as a part of moving on towards a phase 3, whether or not we could use the PRX information in actually managing the patient, we do need to conduct a phase 2 and perhaps try and identify whether the concept holds true when we're talking about multiple centers. In Cambridge, we are privileged because we sit within a large neurosciences academic department. We have got a brain physics department with lots of geeky people who can come and sort this out. But this is labor intensive, and we don't really know whether the concept would hold true. For example, when it comes to Manchester, to Gayathri's team, who are not familiar with this concept, whether this can be used, whether the team would be capable of attaching the monitor and then trying and understanding the equations that come with it. So this is how we formed the hypotheses and the study design to try and understand the parameters of cerebral autoregulation, to understand how we could limit secondary brain injury in pediatrics. We also hypothesized that there would be a difference in the optimal parameters of cerebral perfusion pressure as well as PRX between pediatric and adult TBI, based upon which we might be able to identify optimal CPP targets in pediatric population. And of course, because this is observational and we are only collecting data which is routinely collected during a patient's intensive care stay, we'd also be able to establish a research database of high resolution physiological data, which would help with ongoing research. So then comes so we've identified a population, we've identified the intervention, we've put out question across, but how are we going to prove whether what we are going to look at is making a difference? So based upon our initial work, we created a sample size, which is calculated with the PRX of 0.03 for favorable outcome versus 0.1 for unfavorable outcome, for a one-sided analysis of favorable versus unfavorable ratio of 0.77, and creating a power calculation based upon that. The actual number of patients that came up was 120. And then we gave some allowance for the losses, by which I mean the protocol violation, if the patients withdraw consent, or there is some loss to follow up. The total numbers came up to 135 patients. And we're talking about a study that we're basing inside the UK, and we have much smaller numbers of severe traumatic brain injury patients admitted to PICUs. We're looking at recruiting 16 years of younger patients admitted to PICU with traumatic brain injury, which is confirmed either on CT or MRI, who actually clinically require intracranial pressure and arterial pressure monitoring. We did not identify any exclusion criteria to this. And based upon the previous experience from acute research and the fact that this is a purely observational study, we took patients' consent on follow-up before the patient was discharged. So the actual monitoring and the data collection started before we approached the families. And there's a precedence of that in acute research and certainly in the pediatric population. Because if you think about it, when a child comes in critically sick, it just seems to be the wrong time point to ask family about consenting for any kind of study, because they're still trying to come to terms with the fact that their child is in critical care and there is too much of other information being given to them. So what is called either a deferred consent or a consent waiver for these studies that happen in this acute setting is an important evolving concept. And we've been using it not just for this is a purely observational study, but also for interventional studies. And I won't go into the details of that. So this is what we identified as our inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then we started thinking about how we would impart the knowledge that we have collected and how we would disseminate it so that the teams, the 10 sites that we have agreed to go to, would use this concept. So we created what we called as cheat sheets as to how they would be collecting the data onto the laptop. So the study laptops were supplied from the main site, which is the sponsor, which is Cambridge. And the laptops were configured with the study software and the entire paraphernalia that is required for the laptop to attach to the bedside monitor. And then exactly how to put the clinical events when, for example, a patient is moved. So all the information that we are looking at, for example, the changes in intracranial pressure or cerebral perfusion pressure, are actually more meaningful when we know if they are related to any kind of intervention that has happened to the patient. And this comes embedded within the software. So the clinical teams, the bedside nurse, can actually just click on the button and it would collect alongside the physiological information to say that the patient required suction, for example, or had a fluid bolus or a hypertonic saline bolus, etc. We also created the CRFs, as we call them, for the data collection. So the variables that we agreed to collect were, of course, the physiological data, which was being collected into the laptop. And with the plan that should be connected as soon as the intracranial pressure wire goes in, and as soon as the team feels comfortable to connect the laptop to the bedside monitor, as well as the clinical information. So demographic information, what happened to the patient before they reached PICU, when was the neuromonitoring started, when was it withdrawn, the severity scores for intensive care as well as trauma, and then the discharge pathway. And then also the research forms for laboratory values, the TBI-related medical and surgical interventions and complications, which were collected every day. And then, of course, the outcome assessments. So I guess, although one says hindsight is a good thing, we agreed that we would only go for telephone follow-up and not invite the families to come back. And perhaps that's where the experience from other studies is helpful. This came from the back of our experience of recruiting patients for ADAPT and then trying to get them back for a face-to-face follow-up at 12 months, which is extremely difficult. So we agreed that given the fact that we would be doing this study in limited budget, we should probably just do telephone-based follow-up. So this is what our outcome measures were. And this is how we go about designing a study. So we've identified the question, we've identified what exact intervention we are studying. In our case, it's PRX. And then we identified the actual inclusion, exclusion criteria, what kind of variables we are collecting, how are we collecting. And now there are more web-based platforms to collect clinical information. We use the editable PDFs and then used an automated software to extract that information from that. And then, of course, where do we get these patients from? And we then go about trying to identify the centers within UK which do neurocritical care, where patients with pediatric traumatic brain injury would go to and who are frequently using intracranial pressures. So this is the final list of the 10 centers who were part of our study. After having approached possibly 14. And at this time, I'd possibly stop for a second and let Gayathri chip in with her experience of being the site PI.
Thanks, Shruti. So I guess what I wanted to draw everyone's attention to is that a lot of work happens in terms of research governance, in terms of protocol, in terms of sponsorship, and trying to get that funding and the initial discussions with different centers before the study actually comes to a center in UK. And a lot of this work all of this work actually is done by the team that is sponsoring this study and the chief investigator, in this case, Shruti. And for every study in the UK, our policy is such that it is very important to have a sponsor, which is the main team. Then there is a chief investigator, which is Shruti, who comes from the main team. There is a legal representative for the sponsor, who the trust usually appoints. Then there is the principal investigator, which is each of us in these 10 centers. And then there is a data controller who, so research governance is extremely important, and the governance of data and how you approach patients, the consenting, all of that, it really needs to be thought through before CIs end up approaching these centers. Now, most centers, every center has a different setup for a research team. Our center had just developed its research team at that time. So this was one of our first studies. We had a research nurse who was working part-time. And essentially, an email went off to all of us saying, do you think we'll be able to support the study? And we spoke to our research governance team, which sits right at the center of the organization, asked them if we can support the study, if they're able to pay for our research nurse to support the study. And they agreed. And that's how we first accepted the study. Now, what does a PI do? Essentially, the PI's role is to follow the day-to-day running of the research, right, of the protocol. And in this, we are supported by the research nurses. I must say that without the support of research nurses, it is very hard to run these studies, because you really need to be on top of collection of the data, make sure that the forms are filled properly, they're accurate. There's some kind of, review of the accuracy of the data that is being submitted to the central site. And of course, you need to follow all the policies. So when the study came to us, when we accepted, I guess for us, it was more about trying to understand what the study was about. And there is something called as a site visit that happened. So after we accepted, Shruti and her team came and they had a site visit where they also assessed the site, and they taught us what we need to do. They also taught the relevant people what they need to do. And then there is an education package that comes along with most of these studies. And then it is our responsibility to disseminate that information. And it is a little hard for the first 2 or 3 patients that you recruit. You have to be more hands-on. But as the staff start getting used to collecting this kind of data, and the interventions that Shruti talked about that the nurses needed to do bedside, which they needed to document, once they started getting used to doing that, it became it just became practice. So I'll stop here, and then at whichever point or whatever else Shruti wants me to add, I will add.
Thank you, Gayathri. Thanks a lot. So I guess once we've created this pathway, we also start looking at the sites. And as Gayathri pointed out, we make site visits and try and understand whether the kind of research that we're proposing would be feasible within the structure that they have, the infrastructure. And I guess we are quite lucky within UK, because we also have what is called as the clinical research network. So each region has that network, and they support the research nursing costs, and that's how there's a pool of nurses who then go about helping with all kinds of different research. So like in Cambridge, we've got 2 PICU research nurses whose role is to try and recruit patients, consent, look at the data collection, report the data, the protocol violations, etc., and talk to families at length. So we then started looking for the funding on the side, and I must confess, it's quite a painful process to go through and try and identify funding for research. This came after 6 rejections, and the charity, the Action Medical Charity, when we submitted the research proposal to them, they said, we have really given very high marks to your research, but we don't have the appropriate funding. So we started with £500,000 because I was very ambitious and I also wanted to do a research MRI on the follow-up, which is a huge cost. But then very soon you also realize that the question you're asking has to be focused. And although we can all be very ambitious, we live in a world where there is some or the other form of research resource limitation. And then you quickly move from trying to create an art of ideal to what is now I call the art of possible. So we kept cutting the costs, and finally it came to just under £150,000. And there was a huge input from, as you could see, possibly the logos on the bottom of all my slides, they actually represent different teams and institutes that supported this study. So the Department of Clinical Neurosciences funded the entire hardware. So all the laptops and the research paraphernalia came from them. This is the brain physics logo for intensive care monitoring ICM Plus software. They supplied the software for the study for free because this was the first time study on PRX was being done in multicenter fashion in pediatrics. This, of course, Cambridge University Hospitals is the sponsor. ACT is the Addenbrooke's Charitable Trust, which is based here in Cambridge. And they supported the Cambridge costs for the project. Action Medical Research actually linked up with ACT. And although I work in Cambridge and ACT is a part of our hospital, I had no say. I did not even know till after the funding came that ACT was supporting the Cambridge costs because the Action Medical Research approached them. And then, of course, the University Department of Paediatrics, which I work with, was humongously helpful. So finally, we got the grant allocated to us in December 2017. And as I have already highlighted all these different areas and people who supported the study, I'll quickly move on. And we were already in the process of trying to finalize various documents that Gayathri very briefly mentioned, because I've now identified my question, population, centers, and money, but how am I going to actually do this? And there comes the approvals. So we need to have a well-written study protocol, which fully defines what we're going to do, why we're doing it, how we're going to do it, how we're going to do the statistical analysis of the patients, where will we publish it, how will we approach the patients, what would be the consenting like. And this is so crucial for any kind of research study that it takes a huge amount of effort. And trust me, it is extremely important. It is frustrating, but once you're past that, you realize why every study has to go through the scrutiny, because short of that, we cannot. I might have a very brilliant idea, which I think would work, but I'm not the patient, and somebody has to be the voice and be the advocate for the patient. And this is what the ethics committees within UK do. So you have to apply it to an ethics committee, and there are only few which specialize in looking after the pediatric applications, as well as this was a research database application. So there is a specific ethical committee which looks after this. So you submit all different kind of forms and protocols, what your consent form would look like, what kind of information sheet you're going to go to the parents, what kind of information you're collecting. And then there is a team that reviews the study. It goes through multiple layers of peer review even before you're allowed to approach a single patient. And I had to then go to Bristol for a face-to-face appearance. This is pre-pandemic and everything was happening face-to-face. And I had to sit through a grilling interview for nearly 2 hours in front of a committee of 15 people. And it's quite fascinating because the committee is not all just scientists. So they're clinicians, they're statisticians, they are other specialists. Plus, there are some legal representatives, there are some family representatives, so the parents advocates who have already gone through your application, and then they ask you specific questions and try and clarify. And then they ask you to make changes to your protocol or the consent forms. And only after this is given a green light, you can go ahead and start doing the research. So this is how our study went. And from December 2017, when we got the funding, the final date of approval for the ethics committee was 2018. And we set about as the primary criteria of the primary objective of studying optimal PRX with the 12 months outcome as assessed by the Glasgow Outcome Scale Extended for Pediatrics. And the secondary outcome was optimal CPP. And as already mentioned, there was a consent waiver for acute data collection, and we consented the family for data share and follow-up before the hospital discharge. And in came STARSHIP, and of course the quest to find the right acronym, because I was told doesn't matter how good your study is, it has to have a catchy name. And we all chipped in within our group in Cambridge. I created a couple of acronyms, and everybody liked the idea of STARSHIP because, one, it is futuristic, two, it seems child-friendly. And this is what I got our media studio to do, to kind of create a futuristic Starship along with a child with a brain, and then if you zoom it in, you would be able to see some ICP waveforms going in there as well. So this is just to highlight the actual timeline. The first time we applied to action was in March 2017. In 9 months, we got the grant, followed by the application for the research database, and then the provisional approval and final approval within 2 months of that. And then another 4 months to the project actually going live. As Gayathri very briefly mentioned about the site visits, from the time the project went live, we then started driving across the country, which was mainly me, with the data coordinator at that time was Manuel. He had a background in biomedical engineering, and he was the geek. Whilst I talked about the overview, he talked about how to connect the laptops and how to troubleshoot the laptops. And I guess, as Gayathri said, this is extremely important to have the right team and very engaged team, because the first few patient recruitments are crucial, and the team on the ground would forget as to what exactly needed to happen. So availability of the person who can give you a hand with that, which was Manuel most of the times, or me, and even in the middle of the night, if we really wanted the study to be successful, because we're dealing with a disease which is rare, and we would like to recruit the patient as close to the ictus as possible. And then if we leave it for the next day, then perhaps we've lost specific time. So it's a huge amount of time commitment, especially in the first 6 months to 1 year. And by the time we managed to complete all the site initiation visits, it was 6 months, and then we got going. I guess it's also important to publish the protocol before we finally analyze. This actually is honest and sincere way to do research, so that I'm not then changing my analysis based upon the data that I have got. So sort of trying to fit the data into the statistical analysis, rather as a part of good practice and good research governance. It's important to register the study as well as publish your protocol before. So this is what we had already done and BMJ Open. And I am so grateful to Gayathri and team. Without naming the patient number, this is a recording of a patient from Manchester. And as you can see, all these dotted lines on the screen are the clinical interventions that have happened, and the team have been so brilliant, and that is kudos to Gayathri and keeping them motivated throughout. For the bedside nurse to be actually even if it requires a tap on the actual laptop, it's asking for a lot, especially when somebody is not well or somebody is requiring suction or requiring a sedation bolus because the ICP is not well. This gives us a lot of information, not just the physiological information, and then we can correlate what is happening to the ICP and CPP in relation to specific clinical interventions. And we've not yet got to that analysis, but that would be at some stage happening as well. So then we went and started recruiting patients. The first patient was recruited on day 2. So as soon as we had finished the first site visit, and although as you can see, initially it was a bit slow, we had not completed all our site visits till then. But then we clearly finished the site visits, and it's more or less a seasonal disease in UK, because in the summer children are out and about playing, and there is an increased risk of trauma. We were going quite well, actually, and I was feeling at this point, I was thinking that we might be able to finish our recruitment well before the 3 years stipulated time that we had kept for the study. But clearly, things happen which are completely out of our control, and the whole world went into a lockdown with COVID. That had a huge implication. I guess there are periods when you feel very elated, and within 6 months you feel completely deflated. And that was the time point when I started having nightmares of being held responsible for wasting 150,000 pounds and not being able to produce what we were supposed to do. Because what happened was, with the lockdown, of course, the demographics of the disease changed. Everybody was cooped up inside the houses, so children were not out and about. But other important change that happened was that majority of sites stopped recruiting. So 8 out of 10 sites stopped recruiting to the study because the priority was to recruit to COVID studies. So all non-COVID work was suspended. Also, there was a change in terms of the research staff being redeployed to help with the clinical work. And there was a huge lull in the actual recruitment. We did have some in between when the lockdowns opened. And I guess what then also happens is, once your study, which is already not something that people are seeing day in and day out, people start forgetting, because there was a lot of change of personnel as well on the ground. My own data coordinator, who I had bonded very well with and we worked very well together, left. And we then started asking for extension. So in short, we had to ask for 2 extensions given the pandemic. The first extension, which was a no-cost extension for 1 year, and then another, which was a second year no-cost extension. And then starting from July 2018, we should have finished our recruitment in June 2021, but clearly not so. First extension up to June 2022, and then June 2023. And then finally, we managed to finish our last follow-up in April 24 of the last 12 months follow-up. And then about another 8 months to the first paper coming out from the study. So I guess I'll probably take a stop, because I'm very aware that we've been talking for quite a while. And first, perhaps if Gayathri has any specific input, or the people on the call have any specific questions, perhaps we can take that.
None from me. We'll see if people want to ask anything.
Shall I just carry on and talk through a few more slides? So I guess I won't go too much into the details of the first paper, because it's there, and please do read it. So this is just the diagram to show how many children we evaluated for inclusion. So 165 evaluated. Consent could be obtained in 153. However, we did have to exclude 18 patients because of missing data, because some of the laptop data went missing, some of the other data went missing, and then because we had set out to recruit 135, that's where we stopped recruiting. Out of which we managed to capture 124 patients with full 12 months follow-up. And that was, again, a huge issue because of the redeployment of research staff. We did miss on quite a bit of follow-ups. So trying to also change your tactic and make improvements and amendments within the protocol as the study progressed, because we did have to ask for an amendment in the actual ethics application to try and do some retrospective 12 months follow-up from the precedence that every time we take history from a family, we are basically relying on their information as to whether the child walked when they were 1 or 2 or 3. So specific milestones, and the team agreed within the neuropsychology as well as the ethics teams allowed us to do a retrospective 12 months follow-up by asking the family what the child could do 1 year after the ictus. This is how we then went ahead and did the data analysis. So that, again, was a huge step, and that was entirely done by the brain physics department and the clever geeks that sit within the department, because all this large database that we have collected of physiological data, there are lots of data which is not applicable or useful for clinical use. For example, like, if somebody's drawing blood from an arterial line, your arterial blood pressure would be 200 plus. And if I just run an automatic analysis, I would have lost that. So all these 135 patients' data was analyzed, was first visualized, and then was cleaned, which was a painfully laborious process. And then we could run some analysis on that. So I think just the key highlights, despite the pandemic-related delays, we managed to complete the study to the target. The median age of admitted patients was 96 months. And although we did not set out, I guess that is an important question in pediatrics, whether or not we can create some kind of age stratified treatment targets. So we've not managed to achieve that from the study. We set out to see whether PRX works in pediatrics in a multi-centered study, and whether the indices of autoregulation have an association with outcome, which I guess we have managed to prove with the study. And also we have managed to collect, as you can see, more than 17,000 hours of high resolution physiological data, which is anywhere between 100 to 200 hertz. So quite granular, alongside clinical, demographic, and follow-up details. And these are all time synchronized. So this is a huge resource. And we've also managed to use the equations and the algorithms incorporated within the software to calculate the optimum CPP as judged from the cerebral autoregulation status in nearly 82% of the recording times. And just as an illustrative time example of the time trends of ICP, CPP, and the calculation of the optimal CPP and the lower limits of autoregulation. If you look at it, the green line is the lower limit of autoregulation, by which we mean that a blood pressure which is below that would consistently lead to a poor outcome. Is the it's at this stage it's only an association, because we have not manipulated any of the numbers based upon the data we have collected. And then, of course, coming right out to the output, right from the time we finalized the last patient's 12-month follow-up, we have been very busy. As you can see, this was the first set of 4 abstracts that we presented at the International Neurotrauma Conference in September 2024. Some of the early analysis before we could finalize the paper. And we have also used some clever statistical methods which have been proposed as important for traumatic brain injury research. So like propensity score matching, whereby you're taking the actual severity of illness on admission to define the patient's outcome. So we've created these groups and managed to still find the PRX association important. We've also looked at the center-specific differences, because As I highlighted, this was an observational study, so each center were using their own protocols, and we did try to understand whether there could be any specific difference in the monitoring metrics depending upon the center. So this is the mixed effect methods used to study the center's differences. And then, of course, the final output that you would have already seen in the paper. Just to say that this is not the end of the research database that we have created. I'm very pleased to say that we've already got 4 manuscripts in review right now as we speak. And hopefully the next one should be in print by the end of this month. We've tried to use the database not just to look at the PRX, but we're also looking at trying to understand whether we can look for the thresholds for ICP and CPP from the database. And I just like to show you this. These are the thresholds that we have managed to create for ICP and CPP. As you can see, the ICP thresholds are certainly lower than what we use currently. And the CPP thresholds are much higher, even in the smallest age groups. And then the current, this paper is actually currently in review, where we've tried to expand the analysis on the PRX metrics in terms of the actual overall dose above certain numbers, as well as the time a patient spent within that dose curve. We've also managed to do some analysis on the lower limits of autoregulation, and this is actually quite significant result if we can just appreciate very briefly in terms of the low limits of autoregulation in patients with favorable versus unfavorable outcomes, especially in the first 7 days. And then, of course, I guess I'll probably stop because I realize I can go on talking about this forever. But the key highlights, of course, are the completion and the results that we are able to produce, but even more so the fact that this research database allows us to carry out more research within the pediatric traumatic brain injury, as well as allows us to marry this data set with the other existing data sets so that we can expand the numbers and possibly carry out some age stratified analysis on the patient group. So these are all the planned analysis. The first 4 is what's already happened, and then there are clearly more ongoing work happening and plans afoot in terms of what we would do next with our study. So I think with that, I would probably stop. It would be wrong to not say thank you, a big thank you to everybody, but foremost our patients and the families who have agreed to be a part of this study. Of course, Gayathri and team and the other 8 site teams who have been extremely engaged in terms of how they've recruited the patients, collected the data, lived with my annoying emails to say, oh, I need this, that, and the other, and what do you mean by that particular data? And then, of course, all the teams that have supported the research here. I'd just like to end by saying that hopefully I've managed to highlight that it takes a huge amount of work even before we started doing the study. So the actual work, which started nearly 2.5 decades before we launched into using this and then creating a multi-center study. From the time we started, it's nearly taken a decade for us to reach a point where we can start showing some results from the study. But it's hugely rewarding despite all the laborious work, a huge lesson in patience, in persistence, in using a combination of charm, as well as sometimes showing a little degree of annoyance to keep people going. And then, of course, having a large team of supporting people, because every time I lost faith and thought, well, this is not going to finish, there was somebody else who stood by me and said, no, let's just keep going. So that's where I would stop, and happy to take any questions.
It's interesting. Yeah. Congratulations, Shruti. Just such an inspiring story. It's amazing that you and your team, and of course, Gayathri pitched in from Manchester, but truly inspiring a story of determination and perseverance when all appear to be lost. And I mean, it's amazing. And it's so good that you could actually complete it. So many studies start and then lose focus and direction midway. So you completed, you reach your targets. And finally, it's going to be a practice changing study. That's the best, most impactful study that you can do. Is actually, there was a dearth of data, pediatric data. And now you've shown that higher blood pressure targets are required, higher CPP. So it's massively practice changing. And like, rather than look for, I mean, if I were you, rather than look for what more you can do in future, you could take a holiday and go around the world, and you don't have to work for a single day in your life. You, for the next 10 generations, you've achieved so much. It's every intensivist dream, and you've lived it. Big congratulations.
Thank you so much, Chitra, for your kind words. I guess you also become so invested in something, and then it's like, you just keep pushing it forward, and you want to see it to fruition. And I suppose as intensivists, we all love a challenge. We are a driven population, and I guess we just need to find the right, what's the right word, the right substrate to and the support, and then we can launch ourselves to reach the goal that would otherwise seem unreachable.
Shruti, congratulations on the
Thank you so much.
successful launch of STARSHIP. Really Herculean work, and kudos to you, Gayathri, too. Look forward to a lot more learnings. And just interesting to see from your data that the CPP target in 0 to 2 years was actually 60, right? And that's so different from what is, practiced and what is there in the evidence literature, right? So that's a change in practice. So look forward to your other publications from the same data. And I think a lot of, how did you tease out the noise? I mean, that would have been the most difficult, right? Individual, and it's so dynamic every day, every minute, to filter the noise from the real stuff.
Thank you. That's a very, very important question, Indra. So I think the software has also got some embedded automatic cleaning mechanisms. So for example, as I said, so it would automatically clean up any blood pressure above, let's say, 250, because we know that is not physiologically possible, and it's clearly a part of the data where somebody was fiddling with the arterial line, or the patient position was being moved before it was re-zeroed to the target. Or there was a data gap. For example, the patient's gone to a scan or gone to theater, and then there's a gap in the ICP recording in the arterial pressure. So it'll just remove that data. And I guess it's important then we also have to acknowledge that we don't want to have big data gaps and the data to be then dumped. And then perhaps, for example, if a patient has only been monitored for 2 days and has spent 8, 9, 10 hours outside the intensive care environment, we don't want to pretend that other data actually extrapolates to this data. So there are huge amounts of considerations which need to go into how we analyze it and how the automatic software does the data cleaning. But this also then requires visual inspection by a team of people who are used to doing this. And I guess important to highlight again, because the Cambridge team has so much experience and they deal with much larger data sets when it comes to adults. So we are a small fraction. And for the whole team, it was so important because they feel that they have established themselves quite nicely in the adult population, and especially Professor Josnika, who actually came up with the idea of PRX. He's now retired, has been such a huge support. And for him, when I first mentioned that, I went to a webinar when I started working in Cambridge, and I said, well, why are we not doing this in children? And he stood up and said, I've been waiting for a pediatrician to say that for 10 years. So he said, come and give me a hug. And the team has been behind us all the way through in terms of help, in terms of trying to understand what pediatric quirks could be. For example, if I say, oh, this doesn't work in children, and these kind of settings that you've established for adults are too big for children. Like, we need smaller blood pressure targets, or we need small. So all the equations were modified so that they would fit the pediatric data set. So yes, of course, huge amount of work. I think I should also mention that in the actual paper, there are 27 names. But if you click on the STARSHIP study group, there are many more names of all the research staff from different teams, and perhaps even larger numbers who have not been acknowledged on the actual study. So it does take a huge amount of human as well as beyond human resource to create a study like this.
Shruti, just one more question, which I'm dying to ask.
Please.
I saw surgical interventions and the change. So does decompressive cranectomy radically change your pressure reactivity and your
It does.
CPP targets?
So it does. That's again a very, very important question. And we've also done analysis in patients who were decompressed, because essentially the concept is that the changes in systemic pressure are being transmitted to a closed compartment. And that's why we're we're linking it up with the ICP waveform and calculating PRX. But when your top is off, then maybe the transmission is not that intact. And that is a question which is not fully answered yet, but there's data from the adult side where they're saying that PRX still holds true even in decompressed patients. So we've done that analysis, and we've also then tried to think about the patients in our population who would have their skull open, for example, under 1. So whether their fontanelle is open or whether their sutures have not fused completely. So some of the analysis that will come out now would be in the cohort of 98 odd patients who were not decompressed or were not less than 1 year old. So yes, that's a very useful question. Yes.
Yeah, Shruti, I have 2 questions, one to you and one to Gayathri. Might sound a little silly as well. So you get this monitor which gives you a continuous output of PRX, is it? Okay. And so since you're getting a continuous and you have kept a threshold prior to the study that this is the threshold, if it reaches, then I know that the PRX is abnormal, and I'm going to maybe the actions after that will be taken. Is that how the study was done, or you?
No. So I think there are established targets, the thresholds in adults, but we don't have those in pediatrics. So that's why this was a purely observational study, and the paper has reported some of the thresholds that we could come up with our data set. And although the numbers are still small, and I guess it's important because this is still an evolving concept, and we do not want to start using it for changing treatment, which they're using in adults. And they've kind of also done the feasibility study of using PRX derived targets to manage the CPP in adult population. That it has not been established as a part of regular practice. It's still only being done in centers which have those who have the expertise and the infrastructure to be able to use that. So in pediatric population, I think this is purely observational at this point. We've not used any information from the monitor to change practice.
And Shruti, can I ask a quick question? Sorry, Srishu, I just need to go. So before I just ask a quick question and run. It's not related to your study, but I know I worked with David Krishna Menon, who was when I was an intern in JIPMER, and I believe he's the leading force geek in neurocritical care in Cambridge. Is that right?
Yes, that's very true. Yes, he is still there. He's now he's the director of research, and I must confess I have the privilege to work with him now. I mean, for this PRX study, we did not work directly with him because, but he is just absolutely amazing. I mean, I feel so inspired every time I meet him or interact with him on any platform.
I know, because I lost a patient when I was an intern, and he took me out of the campus for a cup of tea, and he sat with me for an hour. And I think I was neurocritically in a very bad place, and I was better after that. So that's
I'll
it.
mention
Thanks
it
very
to him.
much. Yeah.
I'll mention it to him when I see him
He won't
next
remember.
time.
That was
Yes. And
okay.
I think
Thank
it
you.
is so inspiring to see how he functions and how much he invests in everything.
Yeah.
And I remember going to see him when I was starting Starship to ask for his advice. And he only said one thing to me, which I couldn't do. He said, "Can you please also collect a blood sample for each of these children?" And I said, "David, I can't. I don't have the money. The ethics would all change because then I'm introducing an intervention. So you're collecting blood sample. Right now, we're only using the and now I almost feel that I should have accepted that, but I guess again, no regrets. It is where it is, and we're kind of looking at doing more stuff. So the David is leading a large TBI platform, which is funded by MRC, and I'm part of that group from the pediatric perspective. So we're planning some work on that front as well. Sorry, Shrishu, you were asking some questions.
Yeah. And the second question is to Gayathri. Gayathri, what were the difficulties that you faced implementing this protocol in your team, apart from the usual that you did mention? What were the other nitty-gritties that you felt it was difficult to implement at your level?
So I think one big thing was COVID, because we had gotten momentum and people were so used to doing it. And then COVID came and we had to stop recruiting for more than a year because we were prioritizing COVID studies. So trying to get that momentum back again was really hard. And I think the other thing I realized was this follow-ups can be super tricky. And even though there were telephone follow-ups and Shruti had tried to make it as simple as possible, they take time. Parents agree on a date. They will not necessarily pick up the phone on that date, or they will say something's happened, so I can't speak on that date. So they're not as invested as they were when they are in your ICU. And that was a big challenge for us. So like, I think anytime you kind of plan a study in the future in terms of follow-up, because follow-ups are essential, just make it as simple as possible for the families. This was actually as simple as possible. Maybe a shorter telephone conversation might have made it easier for them, because this was quite detailed and quite kind of a longish one. Also, I guess the last bit would be, I mean, I wouldn't call it a challenge. I would actually say kudos to Shruti, her team, and her leadership, because without that education package and that continuous support and that motivation, running a study over 5 years almost is super hard. You have to take your team along with you, and members in the team change, the priorities of the unit change, they want to do different studies, and you're still with the study. And when it comes, there is a lot of work, but when it's not there, there isn't much work. So it's very hard to explain to the management who don't necessarily do the day-to-day working why it is important. And I guess just Shruti's continuous emails, motivation, although she says they were annoying, they weren't actually, Shruti, they were helpful, because it just helped people remind, just kept it in people's memory. I think whenever you're planning a study, also think about comms. Comms is very important. How do you keep your stakeholder engaged? How do you keep them involved? How do you keep the people who have the influence but not on a day-to-day basis looking at your study? How do you keep them engaged in your study is very important, because they carry the power and the money to continue your study to move forward. I guess those were like my 3 big takeaways from this case study. Thanks.
Any other questions?
And I just to say thank you, Gayathri, for highlighting that. That is so very important. And I guess we did literally did this study in shoestring budget. I mean, the only thing that I could fund from that was half-time data coordinator, that only for 3 years, was the study lasted for more than 5. And then, of course, per patient. So every patient that was recruited to the study, we paid the rest of the sum. So we just divided it with 135 and paid it out. But what I have learned is, and of course, it's important to kind of having done this study to prove that this can work in pediatrics. But equally, the next time we're going out to ask for funding, we would try and put some money for the team building, as well as, like, the pandemic didn't help in bringing everybody together at some stage. But I've now gone to some of these team building exercises where the entire research consortium meets together. It's hugely powerful because when you meet people, you talk about studies, it's inspiring, it keeps pushing you to do more than what we all think we can achieve, as well as a useful way to bond. I mean, when I was looking for sites, and UK is small and we know each other quite well, within the PICU population is fairly small. But the relationships are the key here. And I'm looking for people who I know I can work with, who are my friends, like Gayathri. So I'm looking at Manchester. Who am I going to ask in Manchester? It's Gayathri. Who am I going to ask in Birmingham? It's Hari. Likewise. So you kind of go around looking for people who are both like-minded, who are interested in the disease that you're going to study, who you can work with, but equally also acknowledging the local team's perspective, because they might have their own research agenda. They might have the way they allocate studies to different team members, because each center has a research lead, and the research lead sort of decides who can take on the work. So yeah, people, skills, the investment in that team, and engaging with the main recruiters is, of course, the most important part. Otherwise, we would not be able to complete the study despite the funding and a good setup for it.
More power to you, Shruti and Gayathri, for many more.
So thank you, Shruti. You just paved way and told us that one size might not fit all. And maybe this will be the highlight of the next Brain Trauma Foundation's guidelines, which might undergo a big change for pediatrics. And thanks, Gayathri, as well, for giving that input as to how to go about at the center, how to go about doing a multicentric trial, along with Shruti, who was the chief investigator for this trial. Thank you so much for everyone for attending this. And really thank you, both of you, for helping us and doing this for us.
Thank you so much, Shishu, for asking. It's been a huge privilege to talk to all of you.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye. Dr. Bala, you will get the recording?
Yes, I will. And you want me to upload it on YouTube or what?
I don't know how to do it. We can upload it.
I can do it. That's very easy. That's not an issue. Okay. Do you want me to do that? It'll be a big recording.
I think just now we can send it here and then we can put it on YouTube. See how long it takes. Because sometimes they ask for money, sometimes, if it's a huge recording. No?
No, I don't think so. I don't know. Anyway, let me turn this off. Let it finish recording. We'll go from there. Okay, bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.